Why was everyone staring at her like she didn't belong there? The ballroom glittered under the soft cascade of chandelier light, golds, silvers, metals, and memories shimmering in every reflection. Crystal glasses clinked faintly. Laughter, restrained but polite, filled the air like the hum of an expensive machine. It was supposed to be an evening of recognition, the annual Armed Forces Gala, a gathering of pride, precision, and legacy. But all of that fractured with a single scoff. It came from near the podium, sharp and unrestrained. Colonel Alastair Finch, a man whose chest could have been mistaken for a museum of medals, stood tall, his frame imposing even in stillness. His laughter was not of amusement but of mockery. "And who," he said, his tone honeyed with arrogance, "do we have gracing us with that ensemble tonight?" The murmurs began immediately, rippling through the crowd like a disturbance in calm waters. Every gaze shifted toward the back of the room, to a solitary woman standing quietly, hands clasped before her, eyes calm, unreadable. Her uniform wasn't wrong, but it wasn't right either. It was a combat utility uniform, faded, perfectly pressed, without rank insignia or ribbons. Only a small shoulder patch, a hawk clutching a lightning bolt, disrupted the plain fabric. Most didn't recognize the symbol. Those who did stayed silent. The laughter grew faint, replaced by awkward coughs and sidelong glances. Even the orchestra, midway through a gentle string number, faltered to a hesitant pause. She didn't move, didn't flinch. Her name was Corporal Ara Vance. To the few who knew her, and there were painfully few, she was something of an enigma. To everyone else, she was just the woman in the wrong uniform. Finch's smirk deepened. "Are you lost, soldier?" he pressed. "Or did you mistake this gala for a field exercise?" The words stung, slicing through the fragile atmosphere. Some laughed quietly, nervously. Others just looked away, unwilling to participate but too cowardly to intervene. Ara's eyes lifted, meeting the colonel's gaze, calm, steady, unshaken. And yet, for the briefest second, something flickered behind them, not fear, but a faint ache. The kind of ache that comes from being misunderstood too many times to count. Her chin rose slightly, not in defiance, but in the quiet way someone stands up to a storm they've weathered before. The colonel's voice thundered again, meant to fill the ballroom, meant to humiliate. "This is not the mess hall after a mission, Corporal. This is an evening of honor. Your attire, frankly, is an insult to every man and woman who's earned the right to wear the proper dress uniform tonight." Whispers followed, low, venomous, parasitic. "She must be out of place. Probably a civilian. Or one of those, what do they call them, contractors." Ara stood motionless. Her stillness itself was power, but few recognized it. Only a faint tremor betrayed her, the smallest movement in her hand, quickly stilled. "Perhaps," a general nearby offered, his tone dripping with condescension masked as courtesy, "you were invited as a guest and simply misjudged the dress code." No answer. Finch's patience thinned. "Are you mute, soldier?" he demanded. "Or do you believe yourself above the rules that govern the rest of us?" The laughter this time was more confident, feeding on his arrogance. And yet she remained silent. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was choice, it was armor. In the desert, silence could save a life. In the field, noise meant exposure. Out there, silence was survival. Here, it was misunderstood. The ballroom, a world of polished brass and ceremonial glory, couldn't comprehend her kind of courage. The kind forged not under applause, but under fire. Because Ara Vance had spent her best years not in halls like this, but in places where the only light came from tracer rounds. Places where radios crackled with the voices of those who didn't always make it home. No one here knew that, no one had to. She looked down briefly, just enough to notice the small, tarnished coin pinned discreetly to her lapel. It wasn't a medal. It wasn't even standard issue. But it was the only decoration she'd ever worn willingly. Her thumb brushed over the engraved word, Resolute, a word that wasn't meant to be seen. Finch mistook her silence for submission. "Perhaps," he said, his voice cold as steel, "someone should escort this woman out before she embarrasses herself further." The young lieutenant at his side stifled a laugh. That was when another voice, faint, older, uncertain, cut through the din. "Wait, look at that patch," murmured an Air Force general from a shadowed corner. "That symbol, I've seen it before." But before anyone could respond, the warrant officer near the bar spoke louder. "Is that even regulation? Looks like a cheap imitation." More laughter. The colonel's smirk widened, victory in his eyes. Ara finally spoke. Her voice was soft, not meek, not trembling, but quiet in a way that demanded attention. "Sir," she said evenly, "I am here by invitation, and this uniform," she paused, her gaze unwavering, "is the uniform of my service." The room froze. Finch blinked, his arrogance flickering for a fraction of a second. "Your service," he repeated, sneering. "I've served 30 years, Corporal. I've never seen a uniform so unremarkable. No rank, no ribbons, no record. Are you claiming to be part of some secret unit?" The cruelty of his sarcasm echoed in the air. A few officers chuckled. A woman in an elegant gown rolled her eyes. "Perhaps she's delusional," she whispered to her companion, loud enough to be heard. But someone else was watching more closely. A tall man near the back, wearing the dark blue of a Navy uniform. His posture was straight, but his eyes told a different story, recognition, and something that looked almost like disbelief. He didn't speak, not yet. Because that word on the coin, Resolute, had just rewritten everything he thought he knew about this evening. Ara remained still. If they had asked her, really asked, she might have told them what Resolute meant. How it wasn't a word but a mission. How it wasn't a unit but a promise. She might have told them about the valley, a place whose coordinates were burned into her memory. 34 degrees N, 67 degrees E. About the night that bled into morning, when everything that could go wrong did. About how she'd crawled through dust and blood, her hands trembling as she recalibrated a comms unit under fire. About the voices she'd saved, men and women who never even knew her face. But she said nothing. Because that was the rule. No stories, no names, no history. The world wasn't supposed to know who the soldiers of Resolute were. They were the kind that cleaned up what never officially happened. And so she stood there, taking the laughter, the mockery, the disdain, knowing she'd seen things none of them could ever imagine. She'd lost more in silence than most people ever did in words. And yet she stayed silent still. The colonel stepped forward. "Explain yourself, Corporal, or you will be escorted out." The air felt thick now. Eyes darted between them, tension crackling like electricity. For a moment, Ara almost spoke again. But then she unclasped the small coin from her lapel. Her fingers moved with precision, practiced and deliberate. She turned it over in her palm. One side bore the word Resolute, the other, a set of engraved coordinates. Finch frowned. "What is that supposed to be?" A few heads craned to see. One officer leaned closer, squinting. "Those numbers, they look like." But the colonel didn't let him finish. "Enough of this charade," he barked. That's when the Navy officer, the one standing quietly in the back, took a step forward. His boots echoed sharply across the marble floor. The sound alone silenced the room. He was tall, with the calm presence of a man who had seen too much and carried it well. The silver insignia on his uniform gleamed faintly. Lieutenant Commander. He stopped beside the colonel, his gaze cold, steady. "Colonel," he said, voice low but cutting, "you owe this soldier an apology." The colonel turned, affronted. "Excuse me, Lieutenant Commander, do you know who you're addressing?" "Yes," the man said simply. His tone didn't waver. "And I know who she is." Finch scoffed. "Then perhaps you can enlighten us all." The lieutenant's eyes moved to Ara. She didn't look surprised, just tired. He nodded once, a subtle gesture of respect that most missed, but she didn't. Then slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand to his brow and saluted her. The air stopped moving. The laughter, the whispers gone. The sound of crystal glasses and shuffling feet dissolved into a silence so deep it seemed to hum. And for the first time that night, every person in that grand, glittering room realized something none of them had seen before. The woman in the worn uniform wasn't lost. She wasn't mistaken. She wasn't out of place. She belonged. And everyone else, all of them, had been standing in the wrong story. No one moved, no one breathed. The lieutenant's salute hung in the air like a blade of light, sharp, unwavering, impossible to look away from. For a few seconds, the entire gala seemed frozen in amber. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above the tableau, the colonel's pride dissolving, Ara's stillness radiating something no one could name. When the lieutenant finally lowered his hand, the silence deepened instead of breaking. It wasn't the silence of awkwardness anymore. It was reverence. "Lieutenant Commander Miller," the colonel stammered, his voice losing its usual command, "what is the meaning of this?" Miller didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on Ara, steady, acknowledging, as if confirming something unspoken between them. When he finally turned to face the colonel, his tone was ice wrapped in calm authority. "The uniform she's wearing," he said evenly, "is not out of place. It's not disrespectful. It's a uniform of the highest honor." A ripple moved through the crowd, whispers, confusion, dawning curiosity. The colonel's jaw tensed. "Highest honor, Lieutenant, she's not even." "Sir," Miller interrupted, the word cutting through the air like a command, "that patch on her shoulder, the hawk and lightning bolt, do you know what that is?" Finch hesitated. His silence was answer enough. "It's the insignia of Joint Special Operations Task Force 17, Miller continued. "Code name, Resolute." The name hung heavy in the air, strange to most ears, but chillingly familiar to a few. JSOTF-17. Even those who'd never spoken the name before had heard it whispered, usually followed by silence. It was one of those designations that lived between myth and classified reality. The kind of unit that didn't exist on paper, that left no traces except in after-action reports buried behind layers of black ink. Someone in the crowd gasped softly. A retired admiral straightened in his chair. Another general glanced down, suddenly remembering a redacted report from years ago, a line that mentioned Operation Griffin, then nothing more. Miller's eyes hardened. "The coordinates on that coin she carries," he said. 34 degrees north, 67 degrees east. That's the exact location of Objective Griffin." Finch blinked. "Griffin," his voice faltered. That was a rescue operation, wasn't it?" "It was more than that," Miller said quietly. "It was suicide." He turned slightly, addressing not just the colonel now, but the entire hall. "Objective Griffin," he began, his tone shifting into that measured cadence soldiers use when recounting the unthinkable, "was the recovery of a downed Allied aircraft deep inside enemy territory. Intelligence confirmed the crew was alive, but the area was a fortress, a canyon complex under heavy insurgent control. Every approach was mined, every route monitored. Command deemed extraction impossible." He paused. "But someone volunteered anyway." Ara's eyes lowered, not in shame but in memory. "The task force deployed under blackout conditions," Miller continued. "No aerial support, no backup, just 6 operators, one of them a communications and intelligence specialist named Corporal Ara Vance." The ballroom was silent again. You could hear the ticking of a distant clock. The sound of one woman's breathing became the only rhythm in the room. "She was responsible for coordinating every move in that operation," Miller said, voice low, eyes distant as though seeing it all again. The team infiltrated on foot 60 kilometers through hostile territory. The mission was supposed to last 12 hours. It lasted 4 days. And then the ballroom disappeared. The memory began to unfold, not for them, but for Ara. Dust, darkness, a heartbeat echoing through a night too still to be natural. The flashback came alive like a memory stitched from adrenaline and exhaustion. The heat had been suffocating. Sand shifted beneath her boots as Ara crouched behind a rock formation, headset pressed to her ear. Voices crackled through static, panicked, broken, fatting in and out. Eagle team to base contact. East Ridge compromised, were pinned down. She could hear gunfire in the distance, bursts of chaos swallowed by wind. Her hand trembled, but her voice didn't. "Stay off open channels," she hissed into the mic. "Switch to encrypted band 4. I've got your coordinates, sit tight." She worked the portable encryption rig with fingers blistered from heat and friction. Lines of code danced across the cracked screen as she rerouted frequencies through a stolen insurgent tower. It was insane, impossible, but it was the only way to keep the signal alive. Somewhere behind her, Captain Reyes, her unit leader, checked his rifle. "Vance," he said quietly, "they've spotted us." She didn't look up. "2 minutes," she murmured. "I just need 2 more." "Vance." She turned. He was right. The distant ridge was lighting up, muzzle flashes sparking like lightning bugs in the dark. The ground shook. "Move," Reyes barked, pulling her to her feet. "We're burned." They ran. Sand kicked up in violent bursts as they dove behind a collapsed wall. Shrapnel hissed overhead like angry bees. The air reeked of metal and dust. Her laptop screen shattered, data flickering out. "No," she whispered, slamming her fist against the ruined keyboard. "Not now." Reyes gripped her shoulder. "Leave it." But she didn't. She pulled a secondary drive from her pack, a makeshift backup, and started reprogramming it by hand. "If I can't jam their comms, they'll track us before sunrise." "Vance, you'll die out here." "Then at least I'll die doing my job." Her voice had been steady, fierce, the same calm, deliberate tone she used tonight. Even as tracer rounds ripped the night apart, she never stopped typing. Her code went live 30 seconds before the first explosion rocked the valley. Enemy radio went silent, completely dead. For the first time in 48 hours, their team could move undetected. And because of that, because of her, they reached the crash site. 2 pilots, one badly injured, the other barely conscious. She carried the wounded one herself, his weight nearly breaking her spine. Her knees buckled halfway up the canyon trail, but she didn't stop. That was Resolute. Not a mission, not a title, a promise. A promise to never quit. When they finally reached extraction, she collapsed beside the downed bird, the last one onto the helicopter, the first to pull others in. She'd stayed conscious long enough to transmit the final encrypted coordinates before blackout. When she woke, the mission was over. Officially, it had never happened. Unofficially, 27 lives were saved because of her. She'd been discharged quietly months later, her unit disbanded, her service classified. No medals, no commendations, just a sealed file and silence. And that's what she carried now, not ribbons but ghosts. Back in the ballroom, Miller's voice trembled slightly as he finished recounting it. "Without her," he said, "Objective Griffin would have ended in disaster. Every person in that valley would be gone, including me." A hush swept through the crowd. The colonel's face had gone pale. His jaw clenched, his eyes darting between Ara and Miller as if trying to reconcile the image before him. The quiet woman he'd mocked, now standing revealed as a ghost of valor he couldn't comprehend. "I was the pilot on the extraction team," Miller said softly. "I saw her drag a man twice her weight through a kill zone. I saw her stand her ground under fire when every other line went dark. That scar on her jaw," he paused, glancing at Ara, "that's from shrapnel. She refused evac until everyone else was safe. The weight of the words pressed against every chest in that ballroom. The laughter from earlier felt obscene now. The chandelier's glow seemed colder, harsher, as though exposing shame itself. Ara didn't look at anyone. Her eyes were far away, still somewhere in that desert. Colonel Finch swallowed hard. His throat bobbed once, twice, but no sound came. His arrogance, that immaculate wall of self-certainty, had cracked. When Miller reached into his pocket and pulled out a coin identical to Ara's, the colonel's knees nearly gave. He turned it in his palm, the same engraving, the same word, Resolute. "I carry this because of her," Miller said quietly, "because she refused to let me die in that canyon." Then he looked directly at Finch. "So when you see a soldier wearing a uniform you don't recognize, maybe you should ask yourself what it cost them to wear it." No one dared speak. The colonel's lips parted, but nothing came. Not an apology, not even breath. Ara remained still, her expression unreadable. Not triumphant, not bitter, just tired. The kind of tired that seeps into the bones after years of carrying what others can't see. She didn't seek redemption, because she hadn't done anything wrong. She didn't need vindication, because truth didn't require an audience. Miller took a single step closer. "Corporal Vance," he said softly, "it's good to see you again." Her eyes met his, calm, distant, but filled with something raw beneath the surface. "Sir," she replied, her voice as steady as it had been on the comms all those years ago. "Just doing my duty." That was all she said. 3 words that silenced the entire room, more than any speech ever could. Miller gave a faint smile, one soldier to another, bound by something neither of them could ever fully explain to the rest of the world. He turned back to the crowd. "If you're looking for valor, it's right here," he said, gesturing toward her. "In a uniform most of you will never understand." For a moment the colonel looked like a man standing at his own trial, stripped bare of every illusion. He had built a career on recognition, ceremony, performance. She had built hers in shadows, with no witnesses at all. And somehow hers mattered more. The air grew thick, the kind of silence that hums between heartbeats. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, Finch straightened his back, eyes lowering in shame. No words could undo what he'd said. No apology could cleanse what the room had witnessed. But something in him shifted, the kind of shift that only comes when pride collapses under the weight of truth. And as the orchestra's instruments lay forgotten, and the soft hum of lights replaced the crowd's vanished laughter, every person in that hall began to feel the same thing. A slow, heavy realization that humility wears many faces. Sometimes it looks like a scarred soldier standing quietly in the corner. What happens when a room built on pride suddenly remembers its heart? For a long moment, no one dared to move. The echo of Lieutenant Commander Miller's voice still hung in the air, calm, composed, final. The weight of his words settled over the ballroom like a thick blanket, pressing down on every chest. You could almost hear people thinking, trying, failing to reconcile what they had just witnessed. Colonel Finch's face had lost all color. His jaw twitched. His throat worked like he was about to speak, but no sound came. Around him, the other officers, the same ones who had smirked and whispered only minutes before, now sat in an uneasy paralysis. Their medals gleamed under the chandeliers, but somehow looked less impressive than before. They looked heavy, ornamental compared to the single patch on Ara's shoulder. Miller stepped back slightly, giving the floor, metaphorically and literally, back to her. But Ara Vance didn't step forward. She didn't take the moment. She didn't need to. She stood exactly where she was, the same quiet, unreadable expression on her face. The same posture, straight spine, relaxed shoulders, her boots plain, scuffed, unpolished, planted firmly on marble. She had no speech prepared, no need for one. Silence did the talking. And for the first time that night, everyone listened. In that silence, people began to notice the details they had missed before. The way her hair was pulled back with military precision, the faint scar tracing along her jawline, catching the light, the tattoo barely visible under her sleeve, the stylized trident wrapped around a lightning bolt, lines of ink so old they had faded into her skin. It wasn't decoration, it was remembrance. Someone whispered near the back, "She's one of them." The word spread quietly, reverently. One of them. The kind of soldier whose name didn't appear in press briefings. The kind who carried operations that never made headlines. The kind who came home to silence, not applause. Finch finally exhaled. The sound was shaky, fractured. His hand, still resting on the podium, trembled. "Corporal Vance," he began, his voice softer than it had been all evening. He looked down briefly, perhaps for the first time in years. "I." He stopped himself. Words felt clumsy now, like trying to apologize to the ocean for not understanding its depth. Miller didn't move, but his eyes flicked toward Finch, not with anger but with something heavier, disappointment. The colonel straightened slightly, regaining some composure, but his authority, that invisible armor he wore so easily, had cracked. The lines around his eyes looked deeper now, carved by regret. "I didn't know," he managed finally. Ara met his gaze. "You weren't supposed to," she said quietly. Her voice, though soft, carried through the entire room. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't bitter. It was a simple truth. Miller's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Still the same, aren't you?" he murmured under his breath, never taking credit. Ara glanced at him briefly, something unspoken passing between them, mutual understanding, shared history, ghosts they both carried. He gave a small nod of acknowledgement. She gave none in return. She didn't need to. Because Ara had never been the kind of soldier who sought recognition. She didn't need to be saluted to remember who she was. She didn't need forgiveness to move forward. Her entire life had been a lesson in doing what was right, even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching. And yet tonight, the world was watching. The colonel opened his mouth again, maybe to apologize, maybe to explain. But before he could, Miller raised his hand slowly, deliberately, and turned toward Ara once more. This time, everyone knew what was coming. He brought his hand up to his brow in a crisp, perfect salute. And then, as if pulled by gravity, the colonel followed. His movement was hesitant at first, stiff with shame, but real. His fingers trembled as he raised them, his eyes glistening. Then, one by one, the others began to stand. A brigadier general, then an admiral, then two majors near the bar, and then a ripple like a wave crossing the sea swept through the ballroom. Chairs scraped the floor, uniforms rustled, every man and woman in service rose to their feet. They didn't look at the colonel, they didn't look at Miller, they looked at her. And they saluted. For the first time that night, Ara's breath caught. Not because she needed their approval, she didn't, but because somewhere deep inside, buried under years of silence and shadows, this simple act felt like recognition not of her, but of them. The ones who hadn't made it back. The names erased from mission logs, buried in sealed files. The ones whose valor would never see the light. Her throat tightened. She blinked once, steadying herself. Her instinct was to tell them to sit down, to tell them this wasn't necessary. But she didn't. She stood still, receiving it not as glory but as remembrance. The applause began softly. A slow, hesitant clap from somewhere in the crowd, probably a civilian, then another, and another. Within seconds, it built into a rising wave of sound, a thunder that rolled through the hall and shook the chandeliers above. It wasn't polite applause. It wasn't the kind meant for ceremonies. It was raw, human, emotional gratitude turned into sound. Someone shouted, "Thank you for your service." Another voice followed, "God bless you." Then a third, a fourth, until the entire ballroom was alive with it. People stood with tears in their eyes. Some saluted through them. Others simply placed a hand over their heart. Even those who didn't understand the full story, civilians, guests, spouses, felt the weight of what they had just witnessed. It wasn't just about a woman being vindicated. It was about what she represented. Silent courage, unseen sacrifice, quiet honor. In the corner, a military photographer, who until now had been snapping shots of medals and toasts, lowered his camera. He couldn't bring himself to take a picture. It felt wrong to interrupt something sacred. Colonel Finch took one slow step forward. His boots clicked softly on the marble. He stopped just short of Ara, looking smaller somehow, as though the years of arrogance had suddenly aged him all at once. "Corporal Vance," he said, his voice unsteady. "I was wrong, terribly wrong." His gaze wavered. "I mocked what I didn't understand." Ara looked at him for a long moment, not angry, not forgiving yet, just still. "Understanding," she said quietly, "is earned." Finch nodded, shame deepening the lines on his face. "Then I'll spend the rest of my career earning it." For the first time, Ara's lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile. It wasn't triumph. It was mercy. Behind Finch, Miller stood quietly, observing. His own eyes glistened, though he kept his posture military perfect. When he finally stepped forward, he extended his hand to Ara. "Corporal," he said softly, "it's an honor." She hesitated for a second, then shook it, firm, brief, respectful. "Thank you, sir." There was no pride in her tone, no bitterness either, just the calm, professional rhythm of someone who had made peace with her own story long ago. The applause still thundered, echoing off marble and glass like the heartbeat of something eternal. The chandeliers swayed slightly, light rippling like waves over the sea of uniforms. Someone began to chant her name, "Vance, Vance." It spread quickly, rising above the applause. She shook her head slightly, embarrassed, but the crowd wouldn't stop. Even Finch joined in, his voice hoarse, barely audible but sincere. "Vance." At the edge of the room, a veteran in a wheelchair raised his hand in salute. Ara's eyes caught his, and for a moment time froze again. The noise faded. The lights dimmed in her mind. All she could see was his trembling hand, raised high, the unspoken acknowledgement of shared pain, shared purpose. Her breath hitched, and for the first time her composure broke. Not much, just a flicker, a glint in her eyes that wasn't from the chandelier. She blinked hard, steadying herself once more. Miller saw it. He said nothing. He didn't need to. When the applause finally began to fade, the crowd slowly returned to their seats. The sound died away, replaced by something else, a heavy, solemn quiet that felt cleaner now, lighter. Finch turned toward the podium again, but no one cared for speeches anymore. The night had already found its meaning. He cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice rough, "I think tonight we've all been reminded of something we too often forget." He turned, meeting Ara's gaze. "That rank and ribbons don't define valor, character does." Ara inclined her head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, not acceptance of praise but of shared truth. Finch looked out at the room, his voice quieter now. "The heroes among us aren't always the loudest. Sometimes they're the ones who never speak until spoken to." The words hung in the air. They didn't feel rehearsed because they were. They felt like repentance. When the event slowly resumed, it wasn't the same. Conversations were softer, laughter subdued. No one returned to their old arrogance. The gala had been transformed from a celebration of titles into something purer. In a quiet corner near the exit, Ara stood alone again, her back to the noise. The faint echo of applause still lingered in the air like a memory. She reached into her pocket and felt the small coin again, the cold metal pressing against her palm. Resolute. She traced the engraved letters with her thumb, remembering faces, dusty, grinning, alive in that faraway valley. The radio crackles, the gunfire, the laughter after survival. A life lived in the margins of recognition. Miller approached quietly, stopping a few feet away. "You never told them, did you?" he asked. Ara shook her head. They didn't need to know. He nodded slowly. You could have taken the commendation back then. They offered it, didn't they? Yes, she said, but it would have meant giving names, locations, things that were never meant to be public. He studied her for a moment. You really believe that silence is honor? She turned slightly, meeting his gaze. Her voice was soft but absolute. No, Commander, integrity is. Miller smiled faintly, the kind of smile that only comes when you know you're in the presence of someone better than you. He extended his hand once more, this time in friendship, not ceremony. Then I guess some honors can't be pinned, he said quietly. Ara looked at him, then down at the coin still in her hand, before shaking his hand one final time. Some shouldn't be, she replied. And with that she turned, walked toward the exit and stepped into the cool night air outside. The city lights shimmered against the dark sky. For the first time in years, she let herself breathe deeply. Behind her, the ballroom remained hushed. Inside, medals glittered, officers whispered, and pride rearranged itself into humility. Out here under the open sky, Ara Vance simply stood still, silent, resolute. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. What happens after the applause fades? The next morning, the ballroom looked nothing like it had the night before. Empty chairs stood in rows, the smell of champagne and wax still hanging faintly in the air. The chandeliers no longer glittered with arrogance. The flags drooped softly against the walls, as if exhausted by the weight of what they'd witnessed. Lieutenant Commander Daniel Miller stood near the podium, staring at the space where Ara Vance had stood hours earlier. Her presence still seemed to linger, invisible but undeniable, like the aftertaste of something holy. He had returned early, before sunrise, before anyone else. He wasn't sure why. Maybe to make sense of it. Maybe to convince himself it hadn't all been some strange dream, that a woman so unassuming, so calm, had managed to bring an entire room of power to its knees with nothing more than silence and truth. He exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. The hall was cold now, stripped of warmth and applause, but somehow it felt purer, cleaner. A custodian walked quietly past, collecting empty glasses. Miller nodded to him and the man paused. Long night, the custodian asked. Miller smiled faintly. The longest, he murmured, and the most important. The man just nodded and continued on, oblivious to the history that had unfolded under these chandeliers. Miller moved closer to the table where Ara had stood. He noticed something on the floor, a faint scuff mark, the outline of her boot. It shouldn't have mattered, but somehow it did. It was proof, evidence that she'd been real, that she hadn't just walked into that room and vanished into myth. He crouched for a moment, resting his hand on the marble where she had stood. The image from last night replayed in his mind, the colonel's humiliation, the room's transformation, and that final moment when Ara had said, "Integrity is." He repeated the words under his breath. Integrity is. Not was, not can be. Is a state of being, not performance. He'd seen courage before, in firefights, in chaos, in fear, but this was different. This was courage of restraint, the kind that endures ridicule without striking back, the kind that listens to injustice and chooses silence because the truth doesn't need shouting. It humbled him more than combat ever had. He turned toward the far wall where portraits of decorated generals hung in neat gold frames. He wondered how many of them had ever met someone like her, how many would have saluted her if they'd known. The door opened quietly behind him. Colonel Finch stepped in, still in uniform but without the swagger he usually carried. His cap was under his arm. He looked smaller somehow, not in stature but in spirit. "Miller," he said softly. "Colonel." Miller straightened slightly, his posture instinctively formal. Finch stopped halfway down the aisle, staring at the same empty space. For a long while, neither man spoke. The silence between them was heavy but not hostile. It was the kind that comes after understanding has replaced pride. She left without a word, Finch said finally. She doesn't need words, Miller replied. Finch's lips tightened. I didn't sleep last night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing her standing there in that faded uniform. I thought about what I said to her. He shook his head slowly. God help me, I sounded just like the men I used to fight against. Miller didn't answer right away. He knew better than to interrupt reflection. I've spent 30 years in service, Finch continued, his voice low, rough. I've commanded men in the field, I've pinned medals on heroes, and yet last night a corporal, one I didn't even recognize, reminded me what it means to serve. He exhaled shakily. I built my career on speeches about honor. She lived it. He looked over at Miller, eyes tired. How do you come back from that? Miller met his gaze, by remembering it. Finch nodded slowly, his jaw working. She should be recognized, publicly. A story like hers shouldn't be hidden. It was never meant to be public, Miller said. You heard her. Finch frowned, but it's unjust. Maybe, Miller said, but that's how those missions work. The price of their valor is silence. The colonel looked down, the reality settling deep. And yet we celebrate ourselves for lesser things. Miller didn't respond. The truth was too sharp to touch. After a moment, Finch sighed. When she looked at me, she didn't hate me, you know. I saw it. She didn't even want an apology. She just wanted to exist without explanation. His voice cracked slightly. I've never felt smaller. That's the point, Miller said quietly. She made all of us smaller, just enough to see who we really are. The colonel managed a weary smile. You talk like a preacher, Commander. Miller's eyes drifted to the empty podium. No, I just talk like someone who's tired of forgetting what matters. A silence passed. Then Finch stepped closer, his expression shifting to something almost childlike in its sincerity. Do you know where she went? Miller shook his head. No idea. She disappears like fog always has. Finch chuckled softly, a sound more self-aware this time, less cruel. Figures. He stared at the marble again, the faint scuff marks. I'll tell you something, Commander. I thought I'd seen every kind of soldier there is, brave, brilliant, broken. But she's something else. She's the kind that doesn't need to prove anything, Miller said. Finch nodded slowly. God, I envy that. He turned, ready to leave, but paused at the door. You were right to stand up to me last night, he said. If you hadn't, I might never have seen it. Miller gave a small nod. She stood up to worse. And then Finch left, quietly, humbly, as if afraid to disturb whatever sacred trace she'd left behind. When the door closed, Miller exhaled deeply. The weight of everything pressed in again. He moved toward one of the tables, found a folded napkin someone had left behind, and sat down. For the first time in years, he felt old, not in the body, in the soul. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the coin, identical to Ara's, the one engraved with Resolute and those haunting coordinates. He turned it slowly between his fingers. How many years had he carried it? How many times had he thought of her, wondering if she'd made peace with the ghosts of that mission? He remembered her face covered in dust, blood smeared across her cheek, her voice breaking through static, calm, always calm. Eagle Team, copy, you are not alone. That was what she'd said over comms, as their extraction bird took fire. You are not alone. And even now, it was what her presence meant. Even in that hall full of arrogance and ego, she'd stood there reminding everyone that the core of service wasn't about recognition. It was about carrying others through the dark, even when no one remembers your name afterward. He clenched the coin once, then set it down on the table, letting the metal catch the morning light. Some stories don't need retelling, they just need remembering. He looked out through the tall glass windows. The city was waking up, sunlight creeping across the river, turning the surface gold. Somewhere out there, Ara was walking through the same morning, unnoticed, uncelebrated, exactly as she preferred. He smiled faintly. "Still resolute," he whispered. Then he stood, pocketed the coin again, and headed for the door. Outside, the air was crisp, cool. Washington was already stirring, traffic, voices, the rhythm of a normal day resuming as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But to those who had been there, nothing would ever feel entirely ordinary again. A young officer from the night before caught up to Miller on the steps. "Sir," he called out a little breathless, "excuse me, Lieutenant Commander." Miller turned. It was the same young man who'd snickered when Ara was first mocked. His face was red now, eyes nervous. The lieutenant stammered. "I wanted to say, sir, about last night. I didn't understand who she was." Miller studied him for a moment, and now. The young man swallowed. "Now I think it doesn't matter who she was, it matters how she stood." Miller nodded slowly. "Then you learned something." The lieutenant hesitated, then said quietly, "She made me want to be better, sir." Miller's lips twitched in the faintest smile. "Then she did her job." The young man nodded, saluted sharply, and hurried off into the city crowd. Miller watched him go, feeling a strange mix of pride and melancholy. That's how legacies work, he thought, quietly, indirectly. They change you without asking permission. He reached into his jacket one last time and felt the coin against his chest, the cold metal grounding him. He thought of what Ara had said in the desert, years ago, when they were waiting for extraction, surrounded by smoke and silence. She had turned to him then, barely conscious, blood drying on her cheek, and said, "When people stop seeing each other, sir, that's when wars start." He hadn't understood it then. He did now. Because last night, for the first time in a long time, people had truly seen. Not medals, not ranks, not positions. Just a soldier, a human being who had carried more than most could imagine. He started walking down the marble steps, his boots echoing softly. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang faint, almost hidden beneath the noise of traffic. He smiled at the sound. Some things still ring true. That evening, back in his quarters, Miller sat at his desk, staring at a blank piece of paper. He'd been asked to write a post-event report for the gala. Official, clinical, bureaucratic. But what could he possibly say? An unscheduled moment of revelation occurred during the formal proceedings. No, that wasn't right. He picked up his pen, hesitated, then began to write anyway, not as an officer, but as a man trying to capture something sacred before it faded. "Last night I witnessed something extraordinary, a reminder that valor wears many faces, and some of them go unseen. We often mistake silence for weakness, humility for insignificance. But I saw a soldier stand in front of power and prove that true strength doesn't need recognition. It only needs truth." Her name was Corporal Ara Vance. And she reminded me, and all of us, that sometimes the greatest salute is not the one you give, but the one you earn. He stopped writing, set the pen down, closed his eyes. The quiet hum of the city outside became the lullaby of memory. He pictured Ara again, walking away under the morning light, that same steady gait, unhurried, unbowed. He whispered her name once, not as an invocation but as a prayer. Then he blew out the lamp and sat in darkness for a long while, thinking not of medals or glory, but of a single word engraved on an old coin. Resolute. Where do heroes go when the world stops applauding? For days after the gala, Miller couldn't shake her from his thoughts. He'd returned to routine morning briefings, classified reports, the hum of military precision, but something inside him had changed. Every salute, every uniform, every perfectly aligned row of medals reminded him of her. Of that single, faded patch that carried more meaning than any ribbon in the room. The newspapers wrote nothing about the event. Of course they didn't. The gala's highlights were sanitized into safe press releases, a night of unity and recognition. Colonel Finch honors service excellence. Not a single word about the woman who had changed the meaning of honor that night. She had vanished as quietly as she'd appeared. And Miller couldn't let it rest. It wasn't curiosity, not exactly. It was something deeper. Gratitude, maybe. Or guilt. He'd spent years living under the shadow of that mission, carrying his own version of survivor's remorse. Seeing her again, alive, steady, unbroken, had stirred something he hadn't realized he'd lost. He wanted to know what became of her. How she lived. How someone who'd seen the worst of humanity still carried herself with such grace. But finding someone who didn't want to be found was harder than it sounded. It started with calls, discreet inquiries, old contacts. He spoke to a retired operations officer who had once signed off on the task force's logistical supplies. Vance, the man said over the phone, the line crackling faintly. Haven't heard that name in years. Thought she disappeared. She did, Miller said quietly. I'm trying to find out where. There was a long pause. Then, she asked for her records to be sealed when she left the service. Didn't even take her full pension. Said she wanted to start over. Start over, Miller repeated. Yeah, some people try to outrun the noise. Can't blame her. Miller thanked him and hung up, staring out the window. The city stretched before him, loud, restless, full of people trying to be seen. Ara had walked away from all of it. He checked with Veterans Affairs next, but her file was restricted, more classified than his own. One cryptic note in the database caught his eye. Status: discharged, honorable civilian sector, unlisted. Location: Western region, remote. Remote, that sounded like her. He closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. He wasn't sure what he was chasing anymore: information, closure, or the faint hope that he might see her again, just to say what he hadn't said that night. Thank you. 2 weeks later, his search led him west, miles from Washington, into the kind of quiet towns where nobody cared about rank. It was late afternoon when he arrived in a small rural county tucked between mountain ridges. The air smelled of pine and smoke. The kind of place where silence wasn't rare, it was normal. He stopped at a small diner, the kind with peeling paint and coffee that tasted like burnt history. The waitress, middle-aged and kind-eyed, poured him a cup. Not many come through here in uniform, she said. Passing through, Commander. Something like that, Miller replied, looking for someone. Oh yes, who? He hesitated. Ara Vance. The woman blinked, then smiled faintly. You mean the teacher? Miller froze. Teacher. The waitress nodded toward the window. Schoolhouse is about a mile down the road. She teaches the mountain kids. Good woman. Quiet though, don't talk much about where she came from. Of course she didn't. Miller left a few bills on the counter and stepped back into the golden light outside. The road was quiet except for the rustle of wind through tall grass. It led uphill, curving between old pines until he reached a weathered one-room building with a tin roof and a faded flag gently swaying in the breeze. Children's laughter floated faintly from behind the building, light, unburdened, pure. He stood still, letting the sound wash over him. A part of him almost didn't want to go further. Maybe it was better to let her be, to preserve the memory of who she'd been that night, a figure of perfect dignity standing against arrogance. But something in him, the same instinct that once made him dive into danger, pushed him forward. He walked slowly around the side of the building. And there she was. Ara Vance, standing in sunlight, her sleeves rolled up, hair loose for the first time he'd ever seen it. She was helping a group of kids build a wooden flagpole, holding the base steady as one boy hammered nails, her movements patient, deliberate. For a moment, Miller couldn't speak. He'd seen her under fire, in storms of chaos, in dust and darkness. But this was something else. The serenity on her face, the small smile as she steadied the wood, it was the look of someone who had made peace with everything that had once tried to break her. She noticed him before he spoke. Didn't flinch, didn't seem surprised. "Commander," she said simply, setting down the hammer, "you found me." He smiled faintly. "You don't make it easy." "Not my job anymore." He stepped closer. "You're teaching." Ara glanced at the kids. They needed someone who'd show up, that's all. He nodded. "That's not all." A quiet laugh escaped her. "Depends who you ask." The children ran off toward the field, leaving them in a silence that was comfortable, familiar. The kind of silence soldiers carry when words are too small for everything that's been lived through. Miller looked around the old building, the handmade desks visible through the windows, the smell of earth and chalk. "You built this place." "Helped rebuild it," she said. "Storm took the roof last year. Locals did the rest." "Locals know who you are." Ara smiled faintly. "They know what matters. I don't tell stories anymore, Daniel. I listen to them." Her voice had softened with time. Still steady, still sure, but gentler now. He felt something twist in his chest, pride mixed with ache. "You could have done anything," he said quietly. "With your record, even if it's sealed, they'd have given you a position anywhere." She looked toward the mountains. "Positions come with politics. I had enough of that. Out here I just exist, and that's enough. After what you did, you deserve more than enough." Her gaze shifted back to him, calm but unyielding. "You still don't get it, do you? We didn't do it for anything. Not medals, not careers. We did it because someone had to." Miller swallowed. "I know, but still." She cut him off gently. "Still doesn't matter." The simplicity of her words left him speechless. He'd spent a lifetime chasing meaning, in missions, in orders, in ceremony. And here was Ara, having walked away from all of it, yet standing more complete than anyone he knew. One of the children came running back, holding a small wooden coin they'd been carving. "Miss Vance, look, I made one like yours." Ara knelt to the child's level, smiling softly. The coin was rough, uneven, but on it, carved in shaky letters, was a single word: Resolute. "That's perfect," she said gently. "You know what it means." The boy nodded proudly. "It means not giving up." She smiled wider. "That's right." Miller watched, his throat tightening. The word that once belonged to a secret mission, buried in classified files, now lived again, in the hands of a child who didn't know war, who didn't need to. When the boy ran off, Miller said quietly, "You kept it alive." Ara stood, brushing dust off her knees. "It's not mine to keep. It's a way of being. They'll carry it better than we did." The simplicity of that truth sank deep. He realized then that this, her life now, was her second mission. No fanfare, no coordinates, no extraction point. Just quiet service, shaping the kind of strength that doesn't wear a uniform. He looked down at her hands, the faint scars, the calluses from building, not fighting. "Do you miss it?" he asked. She thought for a long moment. "Some days, the clarity of it, knowing who you are and what has to be done." Then she shook her head slightly. "But I don't miss the noise or the pretending." "The pretending." "That bravery doesn't hurt." Her answer hit like a truth he'd always known but never admitted. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The mountains stood silent witnesses around them. Finally, Miller said, "I came here to thank you." "You already did." "Not properly." Ara tilted her head. "Then say it." He stepped closer, his voice quiet, heavy. "You saved me once, more than once, out there and again that night. I forgot what the uniform was supposed to mean. You reminded me." She studied him for a long second, then nodded slightly. "Then we're even." He almost smiled. "You think it's that simple?" "It always was," she said. "We just make it complicated." The wind picked up slightly, carrying the sound of laughter from the children down the hill. The flag they'd raised earlier fluttered softly against the afternoon sky. Miller looked toward it, the simple wooden pole, imperfect but upright, and realized it was the most honest monument he'd ever seen. "Stay for dinner," Ara said suddenly. He blinked. Dinner. There's stew, and less talking than you'd expect. He laughed quietly. I'd like that. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, they sat outside the schoolhouse on an old bench, mugs of coffee in hand. The world was quiet, the kind of quiet city people forget exists. Crickets sang in the tall grass. Stars blinked alive above them. Miller turned the coin in his fingers. You ever think about going back? Ara shook her head. We never left, not really. He looked at her, the faint light catching the edge of her scar, her steady gaze fixed on the horizon. And he understood. Service wasn't something you walked away from. It was something you carried quietly, everywhere in everything. Some did it in uniform, some did it in silence. She caught his gaze, reading the thought in his eyes, and said softly, some battles end, but duty doesn't. He nodded slowly. You always were better at saying it. Her smile was faint, knowing. No, Daniel, you just needed to remember it. They sat in silence for a long time after that, the stars thickening above them, the flag whispering softly in the night breeze. When Miller finally stood to leave, he looked at her one last time, the soldier who had once saved his life, who had taught him humility without saying a word, who had turned war into wisdom and pain into purpose. Goodbye, Corporal, he said quietly. Ara looked up, her tone steady. It's just Ara now. He nodded, not to me. And then he left, walking down the dirt road, the sound of his boots fatting into the night, carrying the echo of her voice and the weight of a truth that would never leave him. Behind him, under the starlight, Ara sat alone, tracing her fingers over the small wooden coin the child had given her. Resolute. Not a word anymore. A life. How long does it take for one moment to change a life? Sometimes a second, sometimes years. For Daniel Miller, it had been both. 5 years had passed since the night Ara Vance silenced a room full of uniforms and egos. 5 years since she looked a colonel in the eye and dismantled a lifetime of pride with nothing more than truth. And yet her voice, quiet, even measured, still lived in his mind. Integrity is. He heard it in morning briefings. He heard it in the silence between words when his younger officers spoke with too much certainty. He even heard it in himself, the subtle check before arrogance could slip in. He'd left active duty 2 years after the gala, voluntarily. No scandal, no incident, just a quiet resignation letter that said, it's time to serve differently. Now he worked with veterans' transition programs, those invisible corridors between combat and civilian life where so many soldiers lost themselves. He ran a small office downtown, tucked between an auto shop and a diner, with peeling paint and a hand-painted sign that read the Griffin Initiative. He'd named it after the mission Ara had saved. But no one who walked through his door knew that. The room smelled of old coffee and hope. The walls were lined with photos, not of medals or officers, but of men and women smiling at new beginnings. Mechanics, teachers, EMTs, students. Each one had once worn a uniform. Each one had survived their own silent battle. Miller sat at his desk, sorting files, when a knock sounded at the door. Come in, he called. The door creaked open. A young Marine stepped inside, mid-20s, nervous, trying to hide it. His name tag read Perez. Sir, he said, they told me you might help with readjusting. Miller gestured toward the chair. Have a seat, Perez. Tell me what's going on. The Marine hesitated before sitting. His hands were calloused, his eyes distant, the look Miller knew all too well. It's just quiet, Perez said finally. Too quiet. I used to think I wanted peace. Now I don't know what to do with it. Miller nodded slowly. You miss the noise. I miss knowing who I am. Miller leaned back, watching him for a long moment before replying. Let me tell you about someone I knew once, he said. A soldier, didn't have medals, didn't want any, but she taught me what peace really looks like. And so he told him not the full story, not the classified parts, but the truth that mattered. About the woman who had stood in a crowded ballroom wearing the wrong uniform and ended up teaching everyone in it the meaning of service. Perez listened, leaning forward, the faintest glimmer of recognition in his eyes. "What happened to her?" the young Marine asked when Miller finished. "She became a teacher," Miller said softly, "built something with her hands instead of breaking it." Perez smiled faintly. "Sounds good." "It is," Miller said. "And you can too. Doesn't matter where you start, just keep showing up." Perez nodded slowly, the weight in his shoulders easing just a little. He stood to leave, then paused. "Sir." "Yeah." Perez smiled faintly. "You talk about her like she's still out there." Miller looked up, eyes distant. "That's because she is." Later that evening, after the last light faded from the office, Miller sat alone at his desk. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old, worn envelope. Inside it was a letter, the only one Ara had ever sent him after their meeting in the mountains. It was dated 3 years back. He'd read it 100 times. The handwriting was precise, firm, the ink faintly smudged by rain. "Daniel, I heard about what you're doing with the veterans. That's good work, quiet work, the kind that counts. Don't stop. People forget that coming home is its own battlefield. You're fighting it the right way. I'm still here, still teaching. The kids don't care what my name was before, and that's how it should be. Every now and then one of them asks about the scar. I tell them it's from learning to hold on when it hurts. We don't stop serving, Daniel. We just change the battlefield. Stay resolute. AV." He ran his fingers over the last line. Stay resolute. Not a farewell, a command, a creed. He folded the letter back carefully, slid it into the envelope, and placed it in the top drawer next to his coin. It was strange how something so small could carry so much weight. Months later, at a national leadership conference for officers and veterans, Miller was invited to speak. He almost declined. He never liked the spotlight. But the theme caught his attention, redefining valor in the modern age. He knew what he wanted to say. The auditorium was filled with brass and ribbon, much like that ballroom years ago. But the atmosphere was different now. A little less pride, a little more humility. When he took the stage, the crowd quieted. His hair was grayer now, his voice steadier but softer. He adjusted the microphone and looked out at the sea of uniforms. "When I first joined the Navy," he began, "I thought valor meant the loudest victories, the biggest operations, the stories that made the news." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "But I was wrong." He glanced down at the coin in his hand, old, scratched, engraved with a single word. "I once knew a soldier who changed the way I understood everything about service. She didn't wear the right uniform. She didn't have the right medals. And she didn't care. Because she understood something most of us forget, that honor is what people give you. It's what you keep when no one's looking." He told them the story in measured fragments, stripped of names and ranks. A woman, a mission, a salute that silenced a room, a coin that bore the weight of invisible history. When he finished, the auditorium was silent. Then slowly one person stood, then another. Until the entire room, hundreds of uniforms, rose to their feet in salute. Miller didn't ask for it, didn't expect it. But for a brief moment as he looked out at them, he felt like she was there, standing at the back of the hall, arms crossed, half smiling, saying without words, "You still talk too much, Commander." He smiled to himself, lowered his gaze, and said quietly, "This salute belongs to the quiet ones, the forgotten ones, the ones who never stop serving even after the uniform comes off." And with that, he stepped down from the stage. After the conference, Miller drove west. No reason, just instinct. The same road, the same mountains, the same small diner with peeling paint. The waitress recognized him. "You're back," she said. "Coffee." "Please," he said, smiling. She poured it and leaned on the counter. "You looking for the teacher again?" He nodded. Her expression softened. "You just missed her. Comes down once a week for supplies. Took the kids up to a summer camp she started near the ridge." "A camp?" "Yeah, teaches them survival skills, teamwork. Says it's about learning strength without violence." Miller smiled. That sounded like her. The waitress hesitated, then added softly, "She's not as strong as she used to be, though. Coughing a lot lately. Doctor says lungs ain't what they once were. Something about old injuries." Miller's heart sank slightly. "She'll be all right," he said, more to himself than to her. The woman smiled faintly. "If anyone will be, it's her." He drove up the ridge that afternoon, through winding dirt roads and whispering pines. The sound of children's laughter reached him before the clearing did. The camp was simple: a few tents, a fire pit, a flag made of hand-sewn fabric fluttering in the wind. And there she was again, older now, hair streaked with gray, a scarf wrapped around her neck, but still unmistakably Ara. She was kneeling beside a group of kids, showing them how to tie knots. Her voice was patient, calm, the same tone she'd once used giving field instructions over a comm under gunfire. When she saw him, she smiled faintly. "You're late." He laughed quietly. "You didn't invite me." "You didn't need one." He walked closer, noticing the weariness in her eyes, the faint tremor in her hands. "You're still teaching." She nodded. "Always." He crouched beside her. "You look tired." "I'm old," she said simply. "Not that old." "Old enough to have stopped pretending it's not heavy." The honesty in her words hit him harder than any confession could. He wanted to tell her to rest, to take care of herself, but he knew better. People like Ara didn't rest. They gave until there was nothing left to give. She gestured to the kids. "They remind me why we did it. Every time they laugh, it feels like something worth fighting for." He nodded quietly. "You still carry it, don't you, the mission?" Her eyes softened. "We all do, Daniel. The question is, does it carry us back?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The sun was setting now, bleeding gold over the mountains. The children gathered near the fire pit, their laughter fading into soft chatter as the light dimmed. Ara stood slowly, the wind tugging gently at her scarf. Miller looked at her, this quiet, unbreakable woman who had outlasted missions, medals, and memory. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly. She looked out toward the horizon. "Regret is a luxury for those who didn't survive," she said. Then, after a pause, "I just wish I could have saved more." He felt a lump rise in his throat. "You saved enough." She smiled faintly, shaking her head. "You never count the ones you saved, Daniel, only the ones you couldn't." He turned his gaze toward the children, laughing, playing, alive. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe this was the count. The fire crackled softly between them. The stars began to appear, one by one. Miller reached into his pocket and pulled out the coin. "I still carry it," he said. Ara smiled. "Good, maybe give it away someday." "To who?" She looked toward the children again. "Someone who will understand what it means." He nodded. "And you?" She held up her hand, the same old trident tattoo, faint but unforgotten. "I don't need it anymore. It's already in me." That night, as he drove away from the ridge, Miller kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The campfire glowed like a beacon behind him, small, steadfast, eternal. He didn't know that it would be the last time he'd see her alive. But somehow, deep down, he knew it anyway. And for the rest of his life, whenever he saw a flag raised by small hands or heard a soldier whisper about quiet courage, he would think of her, Ara Vance, the woman who taught the world that valor isn't the noise you make. It's the silence you keep. How do you say goodbye to someone who never said goodbye themselves? It began, as these things often do, not with an announcement but with a letter. 3 months after that evening at the mountain camp, Daniel Miller received a plain brown envelope with no return address. The handwriting on the front stopped his breath cold, precise, angled, unmistakably hers. He didn't open it right away. He sat there for a long time, staring at it, the paper trembling faintly in his hands. He already knew. The envelope wasn't sealed with glue, just folded neatly like a soldier's flag, precise corners, careful edges. Inside was a single page. Daniel, if you're reading this, I probably ran out of road. Don't make it a tragedy. I've had more years than I ever expected. You once asked if I missed the noise. The answer's still no. The quiet gave me back what the war took. There's something you should do for me. Not for me, really for them. For the ones still trying to remember who they are after the uniform comes off. Go back to the gala next year. Stand where I stood. Tell them what you told me, that integrity isn't a decoration. It's a decision. And one more thing. Don't let the word Resolute die with the people who carried it. Give it to the ones who need it next. AV. He read it twice, then 3 times. Then he folded it carefully like something sacred and pressed it to his chest. She hadn't signed it Ara. Just AV, the same initials stamped on mission files, dog tags, forgotten reports. Even in death she stayed the same, unadorned, direct, purposeful. Miller sat for a long time in silence, listening to the ticking of the clock. Then he picked up the phone. The funeral wasn't public. It wasn't even official. There were no rifles, no bugles, no flags folded over caskets. Just a small gathering in the same mountain clearing where she had taught the children. It was early morning, the kind of morning she loved. Mist hanging low over the trees, the smell of pine and rain, the world still whispering instead of speaking. A few locals stood scattered among the pines, the children she'd taught, now older, the townspeople she'd helped rebuild after the storm. And then, a few faces from another world, Miller, Colonel Finch, and 2 others from the old task force who had quietly flown in without insignia or salute. She left no instructions for a eulogy, just a note that said, "Keep it quiet. The work matters more than the words." Miller stood beside a simple wooden marker. No marble, no dates, just a single engraving. AV Resolute. Finch, standing a few steps behind him, cleared his throat quietly. She didn't want a headstone. Miller shook his head. She said it wasn't about where she's buried, it's about where she stood. Finch nodded, his eyes damp. "I've spent most of my life giving speeches about valor," he said softly. "None of them ever felt real until I met her." He knelt briefly, pressing his hand against the wooden marker. "You taught me more in one night than 30 years of service ever did," he whispered. When he stood again, Miller could see the change in him, the old pride replaced by humility. The man who once mocked her had become her most devoted student. They said nothing else for a while. The wind carried the faint sound of a flag flapping, the same handmade one the children had raised that first summer. When the ceremony ended, the others drifted away one by one, leaving Miller alone. He crouched by the grave, tracing the carved letters with his thumb. "Resolute," he murmured, "you always were." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his coin, the one she'd told him to pass on someday. He placed it at the base of the marker, letting it sink slightly into the damp earth. "There," he whispered, "mission complete." The words cracked in his throat, breaking on the edges of grief. He stayed there until the sun rose fully, turning the mist gold. And when he finally stood, his shadow stretched long across the clearing, a soldier's silhouette walking away from the only battlefield that ever truly mattered. Months passed, seasons turned. Life continued in the quiet way it always does after the extraordinary has gone. But her name, her story, didn't fade. At the Griffin Initiative, Miller started something new. He called it the Resolute Program, a mentorship network for veterans who had lost their sense of purpose after leaving the service. No uniforms, no hierarchy, just shared humanity. Each mentor carried a small token, a replica of the old coin. One side read Resolute. The other bore no coordinates this time, just a simple phrase she had once spoken. "You are not alone." The program grew quietly, city by city, base by base. No publicity, no press, just lives changing, one quiet conversation at a time. Sometimes Miller would catch sight of one of the coins in the hands of a young veteran at a coffee shop or pinned to the dashboard of an old truck. He never told them who started it. He didn't need to. The spirit of Ara Vance didn't need credit. It only needed continuity. 1 year later, almost to the day, Miller returned to Washington, back to the same ballroom where it all began. The annual gala looked the same on the surface, the gleaming medals, the crisp uniforms, the speeches. But something felt different now. The laughter was quieter, the pride more tempered. There were fewer eyes looking down, more looking inward. When the host introduced him, Miller stepped to the podium slowly, scanning the crowd. Many faces were familiar, Finch among them, older now, his expression softer, almost fatherly. Miller cleared his throat, his voice calm and deliberate. "A few years ago," he began, "in this very room, someone reminded us what honor looks like when it isn't wearing medals." The room stilled, every eye lifted. "She was a soldier," he continued, "and she stood here wearing a uniform most of us didn't recognize. Some of us laughed, some stayed silent. Only one man saluted." He paused. Her name was Ara Vance. A soft murmur rippled through the crowd. Some recognized it now, the whispers, the story, the myth that had spread quietly through the ranks like gospel. "She taught us that courage doesn't need noise," Miller said. "That sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is stand still while the world tries to move her." He reached into his pocket and held up a coin. "She called it Resolute. It wasn't a mission name. It was a promise to never stop serving, no matter what uniform you wear." He placed the coin on the podium. The room was utterly silent. "She's gone now," he said softly, "but her lesson is." He looked around, meeting the eyes of the crowd, generals, cadets, civilians alike. "If you want to honor her or anyone like her, don't do it with applause. Do it with how you live, with how you treat the people no one sees, with the integrity that doesn't need to announce itself." He stepped back from the microphone, letting the silence stretch, the same kind of silence she had once ruled with quiet grace. Then slowly from the back of the room, someone stood and saluted. Then another, and another, until once again the entire room was standing, not for spectacle this time, but for remembrance. The chandeliers gleamed softly, their light catching on tears, medals, and eyes. The sound of the salute, hundreds of arms raised in unison, filled the room like the heartbeat of a promise kept. Miller lowered his gaze, a faint smile ghosting across his face. "That's for you, Corporal," he whispered. "You did it." After the event, Finch approached him, his hair grayer, his frame slightly stooped. He extended his hand, then paused, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "She would have hated the attention," he said softly. Miller chuckled. "She would have called it unnecessary." They both smiled, a shared reverence between them, a friendship born out of humility and a single unforgettable night. Finch glanced at the coin still resting on the podium. "What'll you do with it now?" Miller looked at it for a long time, the engraved letters catching the light. "Pass it on," he said. "To who?" He turned toward the crowd, young officers standing straighter than before, civilians wiping their eyes. "To whoever needs to remember what it means." Finch nodded slowly. "She'd like that." "She'd roll her eyes first," Miller said. They both laughed, quiet, bittersweet, the kind of laughter that feels like prayer. Later that night, Miller walked out of the hotel and into the cool autumn air. The city hummed around him, headlights, sirens, voices. Life, relentless and bright. He crossed the street to a small park, the same place where he and Ara had once talked years ago after their first mission together. The benches were empty now. The sky was the same, infinite and quiet. He sat down, pulling out the coin one last time. He turned it in his hand, watching the city lights glint off its edges. "I kept my promise," he said softly, "but you knew I would." He closed his fingers around it, feeling the engraving press into his skin. Resolute. He exhaled long and slow. "Rest easy, Corporal, we've got the watch now." A breeze stirred through the park, cool and weightless, rustling the trees around him. It felt almost like an answer. For a moment, Miller imagined he could hear her voice again, not loud, not distant, but right there beside him. "You are not alone." He smiled faintly, set the coin on the bench and walked away. As he disappeared into the night, a shaft of light caught the coin's surface, illuminating it one last time. A small, unwavering circle of metal shining in the dark. A single word glimmered faintly: Resolute. Time has a strange way of folding stories back on themselves. Years pass, uniforms fade, names disappear from rosters and reports. But sometimes, one small thing, a word, a coin, a memory survives. That coin lay untouched on the park bench for almost 2 days. Rain fell once, leaves gathered around it, people passed without noticing. Just a small disk of metal, forgotten in the noise of a city that never stops moving. Until someone did notice. She was young, maybe 23. Fresh from basic training, her first leave before assignment. Second Lieutenant Alina Price. The kind of soldier still carrying both nerves and pride in equal measure. She had come to the city to clear her head, to sit by herself before stepping into a world that demanded everything. She noticed the glint first, a flash of light on the corner of the bench, half buried under a wet leaf. When she brushed it off, her thumb caught on the engraved letters. Resolute. The word meant nothing to her at first, but something in it, the weight, the simplicity, made her slip it into her pocket without thinking. She didn't know whose it was, didn't know the story it carried, but she felt somehow that it wasn't lost by accident. 2 years later, she still had it. By then, Lieutenant Price had seen her first deployment. Nothing dramatic, nothing headline-worthy. Just the slow, steady grind of service, the kind that wears on you from the inside out. Desert wind, empty roads, endless hours waiting for something that never quite happens until it does. One night her convoy took fire outside a rural checkpoint. Nothing major, but the chaos came fast. Smoke, shouting, the metallic tang of fear in her throat. When it was over, one of her men, barely 19, sat shaking beside the vehicle, hands covered in dust. "We almost didn't make it," he said, voice cracking. "We almost didn't make it." She crouched beside him, gripping his shoulder. "We did," she said softly. "We held." Her voice trembled a little, but she kept it steady. Then, without really knowing why, she reached into her pocket and pressed the coin into his hand. He looked down at it, confused. "What's this?" "Something that helped someone once," she said. "Now it's yours." She didn't explain it, couldn't have even if she tried. Because she didn't fully understand, only that it meant something. Something she felt she was just beginning to learn. The young man turned it over in his hand, reading the single word out loud. Resolute. She nodded. "It means don't quit when it hurts." The boy smiled faintly, gripping it tight. "Got it, ma'am." Months passed. That same soldier carried it everywhere, through briefings, on patrol, in his boot during night watch. One day he met another unit, a woman who ran a veteran outreach program in the city, a calm, gray-haired therapist named Ellen Finch. Yes, Finch. Colonel Finch's daughter. She had grown up in the long shadow of her father's medals, and the quiet shame he had once carried for years after that night at the gala. He had told her the story before he passed, not about himself but about her. "A woman who taught me humility with a look. Remember that name, Ellen? Ara Vance." Ellen had built her own life around that legacy, healing instead of fighting, listening instead of commanding. She never met Ara, but she felt her like a compass, guiding her towards something gentler than victory. So when that young soldier, the one who'd survived the ambush, came to her for counseling and handed her the coin, she felt something stir inside. "You should keep it," he told her. "Someone said it helped people before me." She turned it in her fingers, tracing the letters, Resolute. She didn't recognize the coin itself, but the word made her eyes water. She knew it. She'd grown up hearing it whispered by her father when he thought no one was listening. It had been more than a word to him. It had been atonement. She smiled softly. "I think I know who this belonged to," she said. A few weeks later, Ellen sat alone in her office after hours. The city lights pulsed outside her window. She pulled out her father's old box of letters, the ones he'd kept locked away for decades. Inside were papers yellowed with time, reports, notes, clippings, and one envelope addressed to him in a precise, firm hand. The same handwriting she now saw etched into memory through the stories her father told. She unfolded it carefully. "Colonel Finch, forgiveness isn't something you ask for, it's something you live into. I hope you do. A.V." Ellen exhaled softly. Then, almost without thinking, she placed the coin next to that letter. Two symbols, two voices, one of shame, one of grace, finally resting side by side. Weeks later, she founded a small outreach center for women veterans. She called it the Vance Project. The logo was simple, a hawk and a lightning bolt. The same insignia from Ara's old patch, the one that had once silenced a ballroom. And beneath it the motto, "Resolute, still we stand." It started small, a few volunteers, a few survivors, one quiet office. Then it grew. Within a year the project had opened 2 more branches, then 5, then more. Women who'd once been invisible began to find each other. And among them, stories emerged about strength, about loss, about the kind of courage that never makes it to the movies. Every new member received a replica of the coin. Not as an award, but as a promise. Some wore it around their necks. Some kept it in their pockets. Some buried it under the roots of trees near their homes, as if planting it for someone else to find. It became something of a quiet tradition, no ceremony, no speeches, just passing it forward. Years later, Miller was invited to one of the Vance Project's annual gatherings. He was older now, slower, softer, but still carrying that same calm gravity that Ara had once given him. When he arrived, Ellen Finch greeted him at the door. She wore a simple silver chain and on it the coin, the original. She smiled. It found its way back. Miller's breath caught. "You kept it." "I'm just holding it," she said, "until the next one needs it." They walked together into the hall, a crowd of veterans, young and old, gathered in quiet unity. On the screen behind them, projected in white letters against a black background, was a single phrase. "Courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, hold on." Miller smiled faintly. That sounds like something she'd say. Ellen nodded. "It is from her letters." He looked at her surprised. "You have her letters?" Ellen gestured toward a small display on the side wall, a framed set of handwritten pages. Some of Ara's notes from her teaching days, found in an old desk after her passing. Each one short, simple, and impossibly human. "Remind them to be kind before they are brave. Strength isn't loud. If you lose yourself, find someone to serve. Integrity is." The words glowed softly in the warm light. Not commands, not quotes, just truths. Miller stood there a long time, reading them over and over. His throat tightened, his eyes blurred. When he finally looked back at Ellen, he smiled through the ache. "She's still teaching," he said. Ellen's eyes glistened. "She always will." The night ended with candles, one for every soldier lost, one for every life rebuilt. When Miller's turn came, he lit his candle, whispered her name, and placed it beside the others. A soft voice began to read aloud the words engraved on the coin. Resolute, steadfast, unwavering, quiet strength. Each candle reflected in the glass walls, multiplying the light until the room looked like a constellation. And in that moment, it didn't feel like remembrance anymore. It felt like continuation. Long after everyone had left, Miller stood outside alone, watching the night wind move through the city. He reached into his pocket, empty now, but still warm from the coin that had passed on. He whispered softly into the breeze, almost like prayer. "You did it, Ara. You made it matter." The wind shifted, rustling the flags outside the building, dozens of them, each stitched by hand by the women in the program. For a moment the sound of the cloth fluttering against the poles sounded almost like applause, not loud, gentle, grateful. Years later still, after Miller was gone too, the story of Resolute became something like legend, passed quietly through generations of service members. Not in textbooks, not in documentaries. In whispers, in campfires, in the pauses between orders. And always, always, with that one word at its center. A word that had crossed wars, years, and lives to find its way into new hands. Sometimes people would ask, who was Ara Vance really? And no one ever had a perfect answer. Because maybe that was the point. She wasn't just a soldier. She wasn't just a teacher. She was a reminder that strength doesn't need recognition to be real, and dignity doesn't need witnesses to exist. Somewhere far from cities and ceremonies, the old mountain schoolhouse still stands. The roof has been replaced, the walls repainted by volunteers from the Vance Project. And inside, carved into the wooden beam above the blackboard, someone had etched the words years ago, faint but still visible under the dust. Be resolute. The children who study there now don't know who wrote it. But sometimes, when the wind passes through the trees outside, the old flag still flutters, and a faint echo seems to linger in the air. A voice steady, calm, unbreakable. Duty doesn't end when the battle does. It just changes shape. The screen would fade to black there. Music swells. A heartbeat of silence. Then the final line appears, white against black. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The end.